They raped her. They beat her.
Massive bruising on the head. And then her little fingers were lacerated, toes.
She had bite marks on her face, cheek, head, arms, legs, chest, torso, everywhere. Literally bruised from head to toe. From the top of her head, all throughout her body, all the way down to her big toe on her right foot.
There are stories the world wishes it could forget, tragedies so dark and unsettling that they leave behind a permanent scar on the human conscience. Among them is the case of baby Brianna Lopez, a helpless 5-month-old child whose short life was defined not by the innocence of infancy, but by unimaginable cruelty at the hands of the very people meant to protect her. She had no safe place, no loving embrace, only the horrors inflicted by those closest to her. To speak her name is to confront the terrifying reality that some children are born into worlds not of tenderness, but of torment. On the morning of July 19, 2002, at around 10 a.m., Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother, dialed 911 from a mobile home in Doña Ana County, New Mexico. She reported that her infant daughter had stopped breathing. Patricia Walters, Brianna's grandmother, was also present, while Stephanie and the child's father, Andrew Walters, performed CPR in a desperate attempt to resuscitate the baby. Emergency services quickly arrived and transported Brianna to the hospital, but despite every effort, the infant was pronounced dead at 11:10 a.m. Stephanie told doctors that Brianna had fallen from a bed at around 3 a.m. However, medical staff immediately realized the explanation did not align with the condition of the child's body. Bruises covered her from head to toe. The injuries were inconsistent with a fall, leading staff to notify law enforcement immediately. Prosecutors were also called to the hospital, a clear sign that suspicions of abuse were overwhelming from the very beginning. The autopsy that followed unveiled the true scale of Brianna's suffering. She had died as a result of severe cranial cerebral injuries. A blunt force impact to her skull within days of her death caused a large subdural hematoma, bleeding in the brain that exerts devastating pressure. The membranes around her brain and her optic nerves showed fresh hemorrhages, a classic indication of violent shaking. These findings alone painted a picture of relentless abuse, but the horror went even deeper. Examiners uncovered injuries to Brianna's private areas, evidence that she had been sexually assaulted at some point before her death. At least 15 distinct human bite marks were found across her body. Her short life had been marred not only by violence, but by unspeakable acts of violation. The autopsy also revealed past injuries, proving that the abuse was not an isolated occurrence, but a pattern of violence stretching over time. She had 2 older skull fractures, dating 5 to 7 days back, untreated bleeding inside her skull, rib fractures on the right side of her chest that had occurred weeks earlier, and fractures in her arms and legs caused by being twisted, pulled, and yanked with brutal force. Each wound told the same story. Brianna's pain had been prolonged, not sudden. This was not the result of an accident or a single outburst of rage. It was a slow, relentless destruction of a child by those entrusted with her care. Brianna Lopez lived just 153 days on this earth, and nearly every one of those days was marked by trauma. Her story haunts those who learn in, not only for the sheer scale of the cruelty involved, but because it forces us to ask a chilling question: how could the family of a newborn, who should embody nothing but love and innocence, instead become her captors, her tormentors, and ultimately her killers? The name Brianna Lopez has since become a symbol of both tragedy and remembrance. To speak of her is to remember the shadows of human nature at its darkest and to honor a child whose life should have been filled with tenderness, but was instead stolen by unthinkable cruelty. Brianna Lopez's death was unmistakably ruled a homicide. The findings left no doubt this was not an accident. It was the result of repeated and deliberate torture inflicted on a child who had not even reached 6 months of life. For anyone listening to the details, the horror is almost unbearable. Brianna knew nothing of safety, trust, or love. Instead, her short existence was consumed by fear, violence, and anguish. She lived in constant torment until the very end, treated more like an object than a human being. The question remained, whose hands brought about this unimaginable suffering? The answer, as investigators soon learned, was as shocking as the autopsy results themselves. Brianna lived inside a crowded trailer owned by her grandmother Patricia Walters. It was home to 8 family members. Sharing one small room together were Brianna, her parents Stephanie Lopez and Andrew Walters, her 18-month-old brother Andy Jr. and Stephanie's twin brother, Stephen Lopez, who had recently begun staying there. The rest of the trailer was occupied by Patricia, her partner, and Andrew's brother Robert Walters. 5 of them slept in the same room as baby Brianna. When questioned, Stephanie Lopez said that on the night of July 18, 2000, to the eve of Brianna's death, she drank 2 or 3 beers and fell asleep by 10 p.m. in the crowded shared room. Awake at that time were Andrew Walters, Stephen Lopez, and Robert Walters. Toddler Andy Jr. was also present. Stephanie claimed she didn't notice anything unusual before going to sleep. The next morning, nearly 12 hours later, Stephanie awoke at 9:45 a.m. to find Brianna pale, bruised, and unresponsive. Panicked, she alerted Andrew and Patricia before calling 911. When Stephanie asked Andrew what had happened, he allegedly responded that Stephen might have thrown her up, a vague remark that raised even more disturbing questions. Stephanie later revealed she had previously seen Andrew throw Brianna into the air, striking her head on the ceiling on at least 3 occasions, a fact she admitted had frightened her enough to tell him to stop. She suggested that older bruises and some of the previous injuries may have been caused during these disturbing games. As for the bite marks found on Brianna's body, Stephanie tried to explain them away by suggesting they came from 18-month-old Andy Jr. But investigators dismissed this. Adult-sized teeth had clearly made the impressions, and the force required to leave them was far beyond what a toddler could deliver. Andrew Walters' police interview shed light on further details. He recounted finishing work around 5 p.m. on July 18 and returning home by 6. Later that evening, at about 8 p.m., he and Stephen Lopez purchased a case of beer and returned to the trailer, where they remained drinking. Multiple family members, including Stephanie, Andy Jr., and Brianna, all shared the same room that night. Andrew claimed he fell asleep sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., waking briefly at 3 a.m. to check on Brianna, who appeared fine at the time. He said he looked in on her again at 7 a.m., changed her diaper, gave her a blanket, and went back to sleep. The next time he awoke, around 10 a.m., she was unresponsive. At first, Andrew attempted to place the blame elsewhere. He suggested Brianna had fallen from the bed and repeated Stephanie's claim that the bite marks were from Andy Jr., but under questioning, his story crumbled. Andrew eventually confessed that the bite marks were his. He also admitted that, like Stephen Lopez, he had thrown Brianna into the air, causing her head to hit the ceiling days before her death. During the interview, Andrew admitted responsibility for Brianna's bruises, though he tried to downplay his actions. "I didn't mean to leave a bruise like that," he said, adding that Stephanie would get angry with him when she discovered the marks. After further questioning, he revealed even more of what had happened on the night of July 18th, painting a grim picture of repeated violence against an infant who never had a chance to escape. During police questioning, Andrew Walters finally confessed that both he and Brianna's uncle, Stephen Lopez, had been playing with the infant far too roughly. The two men admitted to taking turns tossing Brianna into the air, intentionally letting her strike the ceiling before she tumbled down to the floor. They described this in chilling detail, as though throwing the baby like a football, while sitting in the same room playing video games. Andrew even admitted that one occasion resulted in him missing entirely, failing to catch his daughter as she plummeted to the floor with nothing to soften her fall. Brianna was only 5 months old. Each impact against the ceiling and floor was devastating for such a fragile body. Andrew went as far as to examine photographs of his daughter's injuries, pointing out which bruises had been caused by the ceiling strikes and which came from hitting the floor. He also acknowledged that the many bite marks on her body were his own. When asked what he did to comfort Brianna after she cried out in pain from a fall, his chilling reply was, he simply kept throwing her into the air. The question of Stephanie Lopez's role in her daughter's suffering became another disturbing focus. Stephanie was in the same room on the night of July 18th, yet claimed to have fallen asleep after a few beers and remained unconscious for nearly 12 hours, allegedly unaware of Brianna's cries. Many doubted her explanation, questioning how any mother could sleep through such horrific abuse. According to Andrew's statement, Stephanie sometimes directed her anger toward Brianna as well, pinching her ears or throwing her roughly into a bouncy seat from across the room. The horrors inflicted on Brianna stretched beyond physical abuse. At one point in his interview, Andrew described a stomach-turning act of sexual violence. When shown photographs of injuries to his daughter's body, he admitted to wrapping a baby wipe around his finger and inserting it into the infant until his middle knuckle, later noting that it came out stained with blood. Stephen Lopez, Brianna's uncle, was also interrogated by police on July 19, 2002. Initially, he claimed that he had only been in the room playing video games alongside Andrew, with Stephanie, Andy Jr. and baby Brianna present during the evening. Later, he admitted to drinking and confirmed he had thrown Brianna into the air, causing her head to strike the ceiling, matching Andrew's account. Although Stephen insisted at first that he had not inflicted any serious injuries, his story shifted over time. When confronted with the photographs, he repeatedly claimed he couldn't remember what he had done. Eventually, his statements turned even darker. He confessed that while he could not recall beginning a sexual act with the infant, he did remember stopping because he realized what he was doing was wrong, an admission as sickening as it was revealing. Through these confessions and shifting stories, a terrible reality emerged. Multiple members of Brianna's own family had inflicted dangerous and abusive acts upon her, all while her mother remained passive and silent. Brianna Maria Lopez had been born on Valentine's Day, February 14, 2002, in Las Cruces, New Mexico. She lived for only 153 days before her life was brutally stolen by those who should have cherished her most. During this short time, she endured repeated beatings, being thrown, pinched, bitten, and sexually assaulted. Instead of love and protection, Brianna's entire world was defined by abuse, a relentless nightmare from which she would never awaken. Brianna Lopez's final days revealed the depth of cruelty she endured at the hands of her own family. Her father, Andrew Walters, and her uncle, Stephen Lopez, thought it was amusing when the infant cried out in pain. Instead of comforting her, they intensified her suffering, even going so far as to stuff cloth into her mouth to silence her screams. On the day of her death, as Brianna's body was shutting down, Andrew performed an unspeakable act with his finger in a grim attempt to disguise the injuries inflicted upon her. The horrors of July 19, 2002, were not isolated. They were only the culmination of Brianna's short existence, a life defined by unrelenting torture. When investigators searched the family trailer, They noticed something profoundly disturbing. Brianna did not appear to have lived like an ordinary baby. There were no toys in the home belonging to her. Not a single photograph showed her smiling or happy. To make the tragedy worse, it was alleged that her grandmother, Patricia Walters, was aware of the ongoing abuse, yet never intervened. When Brianna's body gave out under the weight of this torment, medical staff prepared her for the last goodbye. A nurse later recalled how Stephanie Lopez, the child's mother, was allowed to enter the room. Brianna lay on the table, her tiny body covered with a blanket, a deep bruise stretching across her fragile face and head. Stephanie pulled the blanket over her daughter's face and simply whispered, "I'm sorry," to those present. The apology felt shallow and hollow, a cruel echo of the protection Brianna had never been given in life. The case proceeded to trial in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and concluded in 2003. District Attorney Susana Martinez sought life sentences for those accused, arguing the evidence made it painfully clear that Brianna's injuries were the result of systematic abuse over months, not a single tragic incident. Lesser charges of failing to report child abuse were brought against Patricia Walters and Robert Walters, Brianna's grandmother and uncle. Both were convicted and sentenced to 5 months in jail. Stephen Lopez, Brianna's uncle, took the witness stand and admitted the unthinkable to the jury. He openly confessed to raping his 5-month-old niece and acknowledged deliberately failing to catch her after throwing her into the air. Blood evidence linked to Brianna was even found inside the pants he wore that night. Stephen was convicted of criminal sexual penetration, child abuse resulting in death, and related offenses. He was sentenced to 57 years in prison and is currently serving at the Level 6 Penitentiary of New Mexico in Santa Fe as inmate number 5927. Andrew Walters, Brianna's father, faced a similar trial and conviction. He was sentenced to 63 years behind bars for his role in his daughter's death and related crimes. Initially housed in New Mexico, he was later transferred to Snake River Correctional Facility in Ontario, Oregon, for his safety. He is identified as inmate number 559,926 and is eligible for parole in 2025. Stephanie Lopez, Brianna's mother, received a 27-year sentence, convicted for failing to stop the abuse and enabling the torture that led to her daughter's death. She served time at the Western New Mexico Correctional Facility as inmate number 59,941. Shockingly, in 2021, after less than half her sentence, Stephanie was granted parole for what officials described as good behavior under a law then in place. Lopez earned 1 day of credit for every day served. That statute has since been changed, but it meant she spent only 13 years behind bars before walking free. She currently resides in Texas under strict supervision, wearing an electronic ankle bracelet. Public outrage followed her release. More than 60,000 people signed a petition demanding her parole be revoked, arguing that a woman who did nothing to protect her abused infant did not deserve freedom. While some portray Lopez as a quiet inmate who found religion, others who served time with her paint a different picture, one of a manipulative individual who knew how to work the system. On her very first day in prison, an intercom announcement warned inmates not to harm her, underscoring the extraordinary measures taken to shield her from the same violence she had turned her back on as her daughter suffered. Brianna Maria Lopez, born on Valentine's Day in 2002, survived just 153 days before her life was extinguished by those who should have been her guardians. Her name stands as a haunting reminder of innocence betrayed, a child failed at every level by the people around her. Though prison rules discouraged inmates from harming Stephanie Lopez for fear of extending their own sentences, That did not stop some from giving her what was described as an unwelcome introduction upon her arrival. Over time, however, the hatred toward her seemed to lessen. Inside the facility, Stephanie worked to convince others that she herself was a victim. She spread a story that Andrew Walters had forced her into drugs the night before Brianna's death, and that she had slept through the abuse only because she was coming down from those substances. This narrative circulated widely behind prison walls. By several accounts, Stephanie developed intimate relationships with other women while incarcerated and even received a misconduct charge for sexual activity in the prison showers. She positioned herself as another casualty of Andrew's control, gaining sympathy from some fellow inmates. But the truth revealed she was no victim at all. On the morning of Brianna's death, Stephanie awoke to the sound of her daughter screaming. She saw her bruised and battered body, but when Andrew and Stephen casually remarked that things got a little rough last night, she chose to believe them and simply went back to sleep. Later, when calling 911, Stephanie lied to dispatchers by claiming her baby had fallen from a chair. Stephanie's indifference mirrored the broader apathy in the household. Brianna's family failed her in life, and shockingly, they failed her in death. When the infant was buried, her family placed her in an unmarked grave with no headstone, ensuring her resting place would remain hidden. Public outrage pushed back. Strangers who had followed her story came to decorate her grave with toys, flowers, and tokens of affection, gifts of the love she had never received while alive. The family responded by enclosing her grave in a metal cage to block visitors. But instead of deterring mourners, the barrier drew even more attention. People bent the edges of the fencing to slip in teddy bears, Christmas ornaments, and memorials, ensuring Brianna would be celebrated. Advocates, including the Remember Me Foundation, pushed to give Brianna the dignified resting place she deserved. After significant effort and intervention from the district attorney's office, a granite memorial bench was finally placed at her gravesite. The question remains, why was baby Brianna treated with such cruelty? Some speculated that Andrew Walters doubted his paternity, that he had been incarcerated around the time Stephanie conceived, fueling suspicion that Brianna was not really his child. While a DNA test later confirmed Brianna was Andrew's biological daughter, the resentment and hostility in the home suggested she was treated as though she did not belong. Every adult in that trailer bore some responsibility for what happened through direct abuse or willful silence. But the most culpable were the three who actively destroyed Brianna: her father Andrew Walters, her uncle Stephen Lopez, and her mother Stephanie Lopez. Each carried out or permitted acts so vile that the question of parole for any of them continues to horrify the public. Brianna Maria Lopez was born on Valentine's Day, 2002, and lived only 153 days before her life ended in unimaginable torment. The people of New Mexico and far beyond have campaigned tirelessly to ensure her name is not forgotten. To this day, thousands have signed petitions opposing parole for Andrew Walters, who faces review in 2025. While such efforts may not halt his release, they reflect widespread determination to honor Brianna's memory and remind her abusers that the world remembers what they did. Brianna's suffering is a wound that will never fully heal, but her name has become a symbol of advocacy for children everywhere, a promise that she will not be erased or silenced, even if her own family try to conceal her in life and in death. Investigators learned that Andrew Walters and Stephen Lopez admitted to repeatedly tossing Brianna into the air, allowing her to hit the ceiling and then crash to the floor. They treated her like a football, throwing her around carelessly as they played video games in the same room. Each time she struck the roof or the ground, her tiny body endured yet another round of trauma. When Brianna was first taken to the hospital, her abusers tried to mislead medical staff by suggesting that the bruises happened while she was in their care. But as interrogations unfolded, their stories unraveled, and they began to confess the truth behind her injuries. Stephen Lopez's involvement went even further. At one point, he took Brianna into another room, claiming he was changing her diaper. In reality, he sexually assaulted her. Nursing staff examining Brianna quickly recognized the signs of abuse, and under questioning, Stephen admitted to inserting his fingers violently into the infant. Authorities suspected he had done more, leading to additional charges of criminal sexual penetration. Stephanie Lopez herself confessed to becoming frustrated with Brianna and pinching her ears, or roughly tugging at her. But perhaps the most haunting question was how a mother could witness the relentless abuse of her own child and remain silent. Even beyond the immediate perpetrators, blame spread through the household. Brianna's grandmother Patricia Walters and Uncle Robert Walters both lived in the trailer. It was unthinkable that they could reside under the same roof, hear the cries of an assaulted child, and yet claim ignorance. It was undeniable that while Andrew and Stephen committed the most direct acts of evil, others in that home allowed it to continue. The contrast was bitterly clear. They knew how to care for Brianna's older brother, Andy Jr. He was clothed, fed, and protected. But for Brianna, there was only neglect and violence. The prosecution pushed for stronger accountability, but legal loopholes held back the full measure of justice. Many criticized the state's legislative system, pointing out that in New Mexico at the time, most lawmakers influencing criminal laws were part-time defense attorneys, many of whom prioritized leniency over stronger sentencing. Even attempts to strengthen laws around child abuse or other community issues like drunk driving were often struck down. While prosecutors were proud of securing convictions in Brianna's case, they also recognized the limitations of the system. For some, these failures meant that sentences did not truly reflect the magnitude of suffering inflicted on Brianna Lopez, a 5-month-old baby who had no protection and no voice, harmed not only by those who abused her, but also by those who allowed it to continue. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories remembered and ensures more content like this reaches others. See you in the next video.